Warning, this video contains spoilers for Dark Souls 1. Have you ever done something stupid and difficult, like writing an entire research paper the night before it's due? Or one of those AP Bio review guides? If you have, you might have felt a sense of hopelessness, as if you're never going to get it done, no matter how long or hard you work for it. This is the feeling that 2011 video game Dark Souls instills in those who play it. On release, it was known for being one of the hardest video games of the time, and still holds up in difficulty today. So, why is it revered as the harbinger of one of the most successful game genres if it sucks so much? It's because of how the game rewards you and mentally changes how you view the challenges of the world. Dark Souls is a game about getting better because at the start, you stink. Over the course of the game, you learn to pace yourself properly, what your limit is, whether or not you should take on certain fights or run, and how to properly upgrade and manage your armor and equipment. It's not about punishing you, it's about making you happy with what you have despite any in-game losses, knowing that you can always give it another shot. Above all else, you'll have the ability to improve yourself, and that is what Dark Souls drags out of you. Before I go any further, let me tell you about the game. The main game of Dark Souls is set in the Kingdom of Lordran, a land run by the Lords. Or, at least it was in the past. Now it's a land that has fallen into disrepair, with no sign of civilization or order. Instead, deranged undead have become the only inhabitants. How did this happen? It goes back to the very beginning of the world, and the nature of how mankind came to be. In the ancient age before the world was formed, everything was still undistinguished, covered in fog, and there were only gray rocks, great trees, and everlasting ancient dragons. But then there was fire. With fire came disparity, heat and cold, life and death, and of course, light and dark. When the player comes along, though, the flames that were once bright and powerful are fading, and soon only dark will remain. This means that the sun would disappear, and most life would vanish. When you begin the game, you are in an undead asylum for those who have succumbed to the dark side and become undead. You escape the asylum and later learn that your goal is to reach the kiln of the first flame and slay Gwyn, King of Sunlight. Then you may offer yourself to the flame and restart the Age of Fire. One of the things Dark Souls does best is to belittle you, even from the very start of the game. When the player first arrives in Lordran, they feel chosen. After all, they had been picked out of the undead asylum by a giant bird, so they must be what the game calls the chosen undead. However, an NPC called the Crestfallen Warrior is there to make sure you don't get too confident.
Well, what do we have here? You must be a new arrival. Let me guess, fate of the undead, right? Well, you're not the first, but there's no salvation here. You'd have done better to rot in the undead asylum. But too late now. Well...
Any illusion that the player is unique is removed, as he has seen many people like them before. It begs the question, who knows how many people have attempted the journey you face, and failed? The total number is unknown, but the game leaves it to the player's imagination. You find the bodies of other undead with items like weapons, remedies, and spells, but you're always taking them off of someone else like you who has already failed. There are even NPCs who tell stories of people who once had ambitions like yours, such as the Crestfallen Merchant.
Another undead, eh? I took on Sen's fortress alone, but I'm no different from those vile creatures. I was driven by conceit. You think you're different? That you can handle it? Yes, I remember that feeling. For I was the same. There's nothing more to say. I'm finished. We're both on the brink, you see. End of story. You bloody fool. Let me give you a nibble of advice. Don't even consider visiting Anor Londo. Not in your state. For a century they've tried and failed. The Night King Rendell, Black Iron Tarkus, and even Logan himself. You won't stand a chance, you'll be eaten alive. But go along if you wish, if only to deepen your despair.
The game reinforces this feeling of the player being entirely ordinary through its difficulty. One of the first bosses of the game, the Capra Demon, is known for being a tough difficulty check by having a super small boss room containing multiple fast, damaging enemies that aren't even the boss itself. Another famous example of this game's difficulty is the keystone fight against Executioner Smaug and Dragonslayer Ornstein, where you must fight two strong enemies at once. Dark Souls takes difficulty beyond boss fights and inconveniences the player at every waking moment. Up until the halfway point of the game, the player cannot travel between checkpoints called bonfires that set the player's respawn point. This means that the player must run everywhere, and the Dark Souls map is quite large. Since bonfires can be very far apart, this means that you can spend a lot of time just trying to go back to an area if you've died there before. This loss of progress can be frustrating. The player's main way to get stronger is to acquire souls from items or killing other enemies. On death, these souls are lost, and the player must return to the site of their death to recover them. However, if the player dies, then dies again before collecting their souls are lost permanently, as the game registers your last soul count as the one after your death. This can make for some extremely frustrating losses, often in hard areas where it's difficult to return to where you were. One example of this is the Crystal Cave area from the second half of the game, which consists of one of the longest runs to a boss in all of Dark Souls. The cave is littered with tough enemies, but more annoyingly, an invisible path you have to walk on to make it to the other side of a large ravine. However, some of this pales in comparison to what is perhaps the greatest sin of the game's designs. The Bed of Chaos is a 5-minute boss runback to what is mutually agreed upon to be one of the most horribly designed bosses of all time. This isn't intentional, but was a result of the game's development being rushed to the point where there wasn't enough time to iron out the issue. There are more things to complain about, but it would be more of the same. Some parts of Dark Souls really suck, but that's the point. The game makes it abundantly clear that you are weak in a world that does not accommodate weakness. However, what makes Dark Souls compelling is how it teaches you to adapt to that difficulty. The game's unforgiving nature forces players to confront their limitations, and it urges you to overcome them. The first boss fight isn't meant to be won. It's meant to teach you that survival often requires retreat and patience. Every enemy encounter is a lesson, and every death is a test of resilience. Progress is not usually given to you, instead you have to carve it out for yourself and think. It's earned through careful observation, precise execution, and an evolving understanding of the game's mechanics. You learn to deal with these challenges mentally and tactically. The game doesn't get easier, you get stronger. In that process of mastery, Dark Souls transforms frustration into triumph, making every victory feel deeply personal. It's personal because its difficulty isn't just a mechanical challenge, it's mental. Unlike games that guide you with waypoints and clear objectives, the game offers you little direction and no hand-holding. Every setback feels like your own failure, but every victory feels like a triumph you alone earned. Dark Souls doesn't just suck. It's abnormally, obviously, intentionally difficult throughout in a way that is so unforgiving it feels like the game hates you and wants you to turn it off. Dark Souls digs at you because it is testing you, specifically, and it's telling you that you are responsible for every single frustrating thing that happens in your game. It's your fault. The best part about that, though, is that it means it's within your control. It's up to you to identify and separate matters that you can clearly say to yourself, which are under your control and what has nothing to do with the choices you actually control. You have infinite chances, and since nothing is unavoidable or insurmountable, it's up to you to change, not the world. The ladder to improvement is a test of patience, effort, and discipline, and all the game has been wanting you to do is sit down and spend that time. You'll find that once you do, you'll begin to succeed, and it won't be so difficult if you give yourself the headspace to learn. What once felt impossible becomes just another step forward, because the challenge was never the game itself, but how you chose to face it. Dark Souls is much more than just a difficult game. It's a reflection of how we handle adversity, one that forces us to deal with frustration, failure, anguish, and self-doubt. In doing so, it teaches us that perseverance is a choice because the game only asks one thing of you, to try again. In the end, Dark Souls challenges you not just to survive, but to understand, adapt, and to keep moving forward.